My name is Leona Marwick, and I turned 68 last winter. People in my neighborhood know me as the woman who walks her dog at the same hour every morning, who still balances her checkbook by hand, and who never raises her voice. They don't know that today, in a pressed sky blue dress and low heels that pinch my toes, I'm standing outside the gates of Magnolia Grove Country Club, uninvited to my own son's wedding. The guardhouse smells faintly of magnolia and sunscreen. Beyond the iron bars, I can hear a string quartet rehearsing their music drifting through the coastal air. White chairs line a manicured lawn where I once imagined I'd sit proudly in the front row. I hold the invitation. Cream paper embossed gold letters, Mr. and Mrs. Alden request the honor. My name is on it. I paid for it. Mom. I recognize Darren's voice before I see him. He walks quickly from the terrace tuxedo jacket, unbuttoned his tie hanging loose. His expression is somewhere between panic and pity. Mom, please don't make a scene, he says quietly. You weren't supposed to come. The sentence lands gently but cuts deep like paper through skin. My son, who once begged me to watch his school plays, now worries that my presence might embarrass him. I study his face, the nervous twitch in his jaw, the flush of anxiety under the charm he inherited from his father. For a heartbeat, I think of all the nights I stayed awake doing his taxes when he started that tech company, all the loans I co-signed, the deposits I wired, so his dreams wouldn't collapse. I could have shouted then. I could have reminded him that the caterer, the florist, the photographer, and even this very gate owed their deposits to my signature. But I didn't. Instead, I adjusted the pearl clip in my hair and said softly, "All right, Darren." He exhaled in relief, mistaking my calm for surrender. I turned to leave, feeling the sun burning through the lace of my sleeve. Then, almost as an afterthought, I added, "But before I go, sweetheart, check your phone." He blinked, confused. What? Just check it. Then I walked back toward the gravel drive, past the line of luxury cars and chauffeurs waiting in the shade. My heels clicked against the stones, steady and deliberate though my hands were trembling. Behind me, I heard the faint vibration of his phone, the first notification breaking through the music. I didn't turn around. Some truths don't need witnesses. They reveal themselves. By the time I reached my car, the afternoon heat had softened the air into something heavy and still. Charleston's river breeze carried the scent of salt and magnolia, a mix I'd known all my life. I closed the car door gently, not slamming it, never slamming, and watched the gates shrink in the rearview mirror. What led me there began 2 weeks earlier with a single message that arrived while I was ironing the same dress I wore today. 2 weeks before the wedding, Charleston was still kind with its early spring light. The azaleas in my courtyard had begun to bloom their pink petals, scattering across the old brick walkway I'd swept every morning since Miles died. That morning, the kettle had just started to whistle when my phone buzzed on the counter. It was a message from Darren. I wiped my hands on a towel, smiling without thinking. He rarely texted unless he needed something signed or transferred, but I still checked his messages first. Mothers don't forget the habit of readiness. The screen showed only a few lines short enough to fit. Without scrolling, Mom Sierra and I talked. It's probably better if you don't come to the wedding. Her parents think it might make things awkward. Please don't take it personally. At first, I thought there must be a mistake. Maybe he'd sent it to the wrong contact, or maybe awkward meant I'd be seated with strangers. But as I read it again, the words rearranged themselves into something unshakable. You are not welcome. The kettle shrieked louder. I turned it off, poured the water anyway, and watched the tea leaves drift in slow circles like ash. The house felt too quiet. I could hear the ticking of the wall clock above the mantel, and beside it, The framed photo of Miles, my husband, my balance gone, 8 years now. He had been a man of few words, but his eyes had always said more than his mouth could manage. I looked up at that photo and whispered, "Did we raise him wrong, or did we raise him too well?" The invitation still sat on the dining table open from the night before. I had checked it one last time to confirm the calligraphy spelling of my name before mailing the balance payment to the Magnolia Grove Country Club. Deposit $4 $200, remaining $8 $400, paid in full from my account ending in 3172. I picked up the envelope and ran a thumb over the embossed lettering. I'd chosen that paper myself, a heavy cream stock with gold leaf edging. It looked like permanence. Now it just felt heavy. The phone vibrated again, another message from Darren. "Mom, please understand. Sierra's family is particular about presentation. We'll have dinner soon, I promise." I didn't reply. Not because I didn't have words, but because none of mine would have fit inside that small bright screen. Instead, I opened the cabinet under the stairs and pulled out the leather folder I'd kept since my accounting days. 30 years of meticulous record-keeping. Tax files, deeds, insurance statements, college tuition transfers, car payments. Every number that built his life. I traced the edges of the most recent sheet joint signatory business loan guarantee, Marwick Analytics, LLC. He had convinced me it was just a formality. I had believed him. I sat at the table with my tea cooling beside me. The sunlight slanted across the floorboards, falling on the photo of Miles again. In that silence, I felt both of them, husband and son, one gone by fate, the other by choice. After a while, I rose and took my notebook from the drawer, the one I used for grocery lists and quiet thoughts. On the first blank page, I wrote in slow, even letters, 2 weeks until the wedding. One decision to make. The pen left a small dot of ink beneath the final word as I closed the cover. Outside, the church bells from St. Michael's began their noon chimes steady as the breath I drew to steady myself. By the time the sound faded, I knew what I would do next. The next morning, the air over Charleston felt heavier, as if the humidity itself had overheard Darren's message and decided to press down on me. I woke early, long before sunrise, and sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee that went cold before I remembered to drink it. The notebook from yesterday lay open beside me, and beneath my short sentence, "One decision to make," I drew a line and began to list what I already knew: accounts, loans, payments, guarantees. The discipline of record-keeping had always been my refuge. Numbers, unlike people, didn't lie. They didn't flatter, betray, or pretend. They simply revealed. I opened the old leather folder that held nearly 4 decades of my life's work and spread the documents across the table. At the top of the pile sat a copy of Marwick Analytics business loan. Darren had signed it in black ink 2 years ago, smiling over dinner at the Darling Oyster Bar, promising it was just temporary. The collateral line bore both our names. Next came the apartment lease in his name, except the guarantor space carried my neat signature. The security deposit, $2,500 wired from my checking account ending in 3172. Then came the car note, the credit line extension, and the wedding vendor ledger, each one whispering my name in fine print. I read through each transaction slowly, as if reciting a rosary. Every milestone of his adulthood, every piece of what he called his life looped back to me. I had been the invisible architecture under all his ambitions, the foundation no one photographed. My pen tapped the edge of a statement. He called me outdated, I murmured aloud, hearing how small and steady my voice sounded in the quiet kitchen. Yet every dollar he spends carries my name. It wasn't anger that settled in me, then it was clarity. The same feeling I used to get at the end of a balanced audit when every discrepancy had been found and resolved. At 9 o'clock, I called the bank. Celeste Rourke, the manager who had handled my accounts for years, answered on the second ring. Her voice was polished, southern soft but firm. "Mrs. Marwick, good morning. How can I help?" "I need to review the list of authorized users on all my accounts," I said. "And I'd like to confirm the schedule for upcoming transfers." I could hear her fingers typing. "Of course. Let me see, your son, Mr. Darren Marwick, is listed as secondary on your credit line and as guarantor beneficiary on your trust-linked account. There's also an automatic wire scheduled to Magnolia Grove Country Club, final wedding payment due in 72 hours. I nodded, though she couldn't see me. "Please prepare the necessary forms to remove him as an authorized user and to cancel that wire. I'll come in to sign this afternoon." Celeste hesitated. "Mrs. Marwick, are you certain that's a rather large payment? It might complicate their event." "I'm aware," I said quietly. "I just don't think it's my event anymore." When the call ended, I sat for a long time letting the words settle. Outside the window, sunlight spilled through the live oaks and glinted off the iron fence Miles had installed 30 years ago. He'd once told me a fence isn't to keep people out, Leona. It's to remind you who should come in. For years, I had let that line gather dust in memory, like one of his old cufflinks in a drawer. But now, as I looked over the spread of receipts, I understood what he meant. I stacked the papers, neatly clipped them together, and placed them inside a blue folder labeled "To Review, Final." Then I wrote a single note on the cover: "Numbers tell the truth, even when people don't." By the time the church bells marked noon, I had made my decision. The next step wouldn't involve shouting or begging. It would involve ink signatures and the quiet correction of a long-standing error. By the next afternoon, Charleston's light had turned sharp and white, reflecting off the courthouse marble, like the glint of something freshly sharpened. I walked through the corridor carrying a single blue folder under my arm, the same one I'd marked "To Review, Final." The air smelled faintly of lemon polish and old paper, a scent that always steadied me. Mr. Halpern, my attorney for nearly 15 years, rose from behind his oak desk when I entered. He had aged kindly, silver hair, round spectacles, a cautious smile that had once guided me through estate taxes and Miles's will. "Leona," he greeted, motioning for me to sit. "It's been too long. How's retirement treating you?" "Peaceful," I said, setting the folder between us, but not quiet enough to be ignored. He opened it and skimmed the top page. His brow tightened as he read the summary I'd written by hand. Clean, factual, without sentiment. "You're amending your living trust." "Yes. Darren will no longer be the sole beneficiary. I'd like the primary assets to transfer into a new foundation, the Miles Marwick Foundation for Single Mothers in Business." Halpern looked up slowly. "That's a big step." "It's overdue," I said. "Everything I built twice, once for my family, once for his chances. It's time something I built stood on its own." He hesitated, then adjusted his glasses. "And your son, should I leave him a share?" I shook my head. "He has enough of mine already. He just doesn't know it's not permanent." He didn't argue. Halpern had known me long enough to recognize when a decision had reached the ink stage beyond persuasion, ready for paper. He drew up the amendment while I waited, each keystroke sounding like a clock hand finding its hour. When he finished, I signed on the final line, the black ink, drying quickly across my name. Halpern capped his pen, exhaling. "You're doing something meaningful, Leona." "Meaningful isn't always gentle," I said. "Sometimes it's just necessary." Leaving his office, I felt lighter but also older, like a tree that had finally shed a limb too heavy for its trunk. The next stop was the bank. Celeste Rourke met me in her glass-walled office overlooking Broad Street. She rose, her perfume discreet and expensive, the kind that announced good taste more than money. "I've prepared the authorization forms you requested," she said, sliding a stack of papers forward. "Removing Mr. Marwick as an authorized user and halting the scheduled wire to Magnolia Grove. You'll need to initial here, here, and here." The pen felt familiar, its weight balanced in my fingers. I signed each page carefully, initials, steady lines, straight. When it was done, Celeste looked at me the way nurses look at patients who've just taken a painful but curative dose. "Will there be consequences?" she asked gently. "There always are," I said, standing to leave. "But consequences can be corrected. Entitlement cannot." Outside, the wind carried the scent of sea salt and paper ink, a strange mix of memory and resolve. I tucked the bank copy into my purse, the corner brushing against my fingertips, like a quiet signature of finality. By evening, the foundation's paperwork was in motion. The wire was stopped, and my name, once a silent guarantee behind Darren's ambitions, had reclaimed its value. 2 mornings later, the sky above Charleston had turned the color of pewter. A storm was forming over the harbor, though the air inside the First Atlantic Bank felt still and cool. I sat across from Celeste Rourke once again, the faint hum of the printer filling the pauses between us. She had already set out the paperwork, 3 neat stacks, each clipped with a pale blue slip, marked authorization required. "The final wedding payment is scheduled to process tomorrow at noon," Celeste said, glancing at her monitor. "A wire transfer of $8,400 to Magnolia Grove Country Club. The deposit has already cleared, but this last payment completes the event contract." I nodded. "And if I cancel it?" She hesitated just long enough to be polite. "You have every right. You're the primary account holder, and the charge is tied directly to your trust account. The club's contract states that final payment must be received in full 72 hours before the event, or the setup is automatically suspended." "Suspended," I repeated. "Meaning no ceremony." Celeste offered a diplomatic smile. "Meaning no chairs, no staff, no access to facilities until payment is received." I leaned forward slightly, hands folded on the cool table. "Then let's make sure that doesn't happen, at least not with my money." She pressed a few keys, and the printer came alive again, spitting out the stop payment form in crisp, white sheets. "You'll need to sign and date each section. The authorization will process within 2 hours." I took the pen she offered, a slim silver one, engraved with the bank's logo, and signed slowly, my handwriting as measured as my breath. The motion was steady, deliberate. When I reached the last page, I paused and said, almost to myself, "Sometimes peace requires paperwork." Celeste looked up. "Pardon, nothing." I said, setting the pen down, just something my husband used to say when he balanced his ledgers. Her eyes softened a little. "I'll file this right away. You'll receive a confirmation email before the end of the day." As I gathered my papers, she hesitated. "If you don't mind me saying, Mrs. Marwick, you're handling this with remarkable composure." I smiled faintly. "Accountants are trained for long games, Celeste. We balance before we break." Outside, the air was thicker, the first raindrops beginning to tap against the marble steps. I walked to my car without opening my umbrella, letting the drizzle blur the edges of everything. The city smelled of salt and damp stone. By the time I reached home, a new message was waiting in my inbox. Subject, transaction reversal. Confirmation from First Atlantic Bank. Corporate transfers body. The scheduled payment to Magnolia Grove Country Club has been canceled at the request of the account holder. Contractual obligations now rest with the payee. I read it twice, then printed a copy for my folder. The black ink gleamed faintly under the desk lamp. Later that afternoon, as I brewed a fresh pot of tea, the phone rang. It was the events coordinator from Magnolia Grove, a young woman named Leona, whose polite voice carried the practiced sweetness of someone used to dealing with wealthy clients. "Mrs. Marwick," she began, "we wanted to confirm that we haven't received your final payment. I'm sure it's just a banking delay, but without that transfer, our setup team can't proceed with the weekend schedule." I could hear the faint rustle of paper behind her, probably my own contract in her hands. "There won't be a delay," I said evenly. "There just won't be a payment." She hesitated. "I see. Should I inform the client directly?" "Yes," I said. "Inform the client. I believe they'll need to make alternate arrangements." When the call ended, I set the phone back on the counter and let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. The house was quiet, except for the rain against the windows and the soft ticking of the kitchen clock. On the table beside me lay the signed form's edges still damp from my fingers. The rain had begun to drum harder now, a steady, rhythmic tapping that matched the calm in my chest. Outside, Charleston streets glistened silver beneath the storm, and for the first time in weeks, I felt the simple relief of a column that finally balanced. 3 days before the wedding, the house felt too quiet. Rain had passed in the night, leaving the air heavy with the smell of wet magnolia and starch from freshly pressed linen. I stood in front of the ironing board, smoothing the hem of the sky blue dress I'd chosen weeks ago, the same one I'd worn to my 40th wedding anniversary dinner with Miles. The fabric had softened with time. Each pass of the iron released a faint trace of lavender detergent and memory. I remembered that night at the old Riverside restaurant, the two of us laughing about nothing, our son still a boy, then asleep at home under a ceiling fan's slow rhythm. I adjusted the steam setting and continued down the sleeve, letting my thoughts wander carefully, but never too far. That dress had been hanging in my closet for years untouched, through birthdays, funerals, and retirements. I hadn't bought anything new for Darren's wedding. It hadn't seemed necessary. Mothers don't attend to impress, they attend to witness. When the iron hissed against the fabric, I thought of the first suit I ever made for him, the gray one for his senior prom. We couldn't afford the rental, so I borrowed patterns from a neighbor and spent 2 weeks cutting sewing, redoing the seams until they lay flat. Darren had stood on a chair while I pinned the cuffs. "Hold still," I'd said, and he'd laughed, pretending the pins didn't sting. He'd been proud that night. He'd looked back at me from the porch and said, "Thanks, Mom. I won't forget this." The memory slipped through me like smoke, beautiful but impossible to hold. I set the iron aside and hung the dress on the back of the door. The soft fabric caught the afternoon light, the blue deepening toward silver at the folds. I laid out the pearl earrings Miles had given me the year Darren was born and placed them beside a matching clip for my hair. They weren't for anyone else to notice. They were for me, for the woman who had always shown up even when no one remembered she was the one who held everything together. I caught my reflection in the hallway mirror, a little smaller, a little older, but still composed. The lines around my mouth had softened with time, not bitterness. Beneath them was a steadiness I hadn't known I possessed until now. Outside, a mockingbird called from the fence, sharp and defiant. I looked once more at the dress, now hanging perfectly pressed, and understood that this act wasn't preparation for attendance, it was something closer to a goodbye. A ritual, perhaps. A way of giving shape to what no longer had a place. I folded the ironing board, set it back against the wall, and turned off the light. The room fell into the quiet hum of the ceiling fan and the faint scent of lavender. The dress swayed slightly on its hanger, like a breath caught midair, waiting for a moment that would never come. Downstairs, my phone rested face up on the table, silent. I didn't expect it to ring. I had already chosen what I would wear, and that was enough. By Friday morning, the clouds had thinned, leaving the city washed and bright. I spent the early hours tending to my garden, clipping spent blooms from the hydrangeas. The air was calm, but beneath it, I could feel something tightening, a quiet awareness that the world was about to rearrange itself. When the phone rang inside, I almost didn't answer. The number on the screen was unfamiliar, but the area code was local Magnolia Grove Country Club. Mrs. Marwick. The voice was polite. Professional, too bright for the hour. This is Elena Rivas, events coordinator at Magnolia Grove. I hope I'm not calling too early. Not at all, I said, setting the pruning shears on the windowsill. I wanted to check on a small detail. She continued. Our system still shows the final balance as pending. I'm sure it's just a bank delay, but we wanted to confirm before we proceed with the setup schedule. Her words floated like bubbles, fragile, rehearsed, hoping I wouldn't touch them too hard. Yes, I said simply. I'm aware of the pending status. A pause. Oh, wonderful. Then the transfer is on its way. No, I said, my tone even. It isn't. I could almost hear her blink. I see. Then perhaps Mrs. Alden is handling it. I imagine that's what she believes, I said, letting the sentence end there. There was a brief scramble on the other end, papers shuffling, whispers, muffled by a hand over the receiver. Then another voice came through, crisp and sure of itself. Mrs. Marwick, hello. This is Vivian Alden. Her tone was warm in the way people sound when they've never had to be questioned. We've just spoken to Elena. I understand there's a small issue with the payment. Don't worry about it, dear. Darren mentioned you were taking care of the arrangements. I glanced at the blue dress still hanging by the door. No, Mrs. Alden, I said gently. Not anymore. A silence followed, the kind that doesn't belong to either party, but lingers like a witness. I'm sorry, she said finally, the warmth thinning to something brittle. Perhaps there's been a misunderstanding, perhaps, I replied. I'll have my husband handle it then. I think that would be wise. We ended the call cordially, as if discussing table linens instead of the unraveling of an entire illusion. I stood there for a while, phone still in my hand, listening to the faint hum of the line after it disconnected. Somewhere in that silence, the sound of composure cracked, not mine, but theirs. Outside, a truck passed, sending a ripple of wind through the magnolia branches. The petals trembled, but did not fall. I poured myself another cup of coffee and returned to the porch. From the distance, I could hear church bells tolling the noon hour. Somewhere across town, Vivian Alden was likely dialing her accountant, her voice sharper now, her control slipping thread by thread. I sat back in my chair, the ceramic mug warm between my palms. The world looked unchanged, the same streets, the same sunlight, but beneath the surface, something had begun to shift. The kind of shift that couldn't be undone with pleasantries or money. The papers I'd signed were only ink and signatures, but they had weight now, invisible and irreversible, pressing quietly on the edges of their perfect plans. Saturday dawned clear and too warm for late spring. The kind of Charleston morning that promised beauty and discomfort in equal measure. By 8:30, I was already dressed, my sky blue gown smooth and cool against my skin. I pinned my hair with the same pearl clip I'd worn to my anniversary dinner decades ago, and slipped the envelope with my invitation into my purse. Not because I needed proof, but because I liked having facts within reach. The drive to Magnolia Grove Country Club was quiet. The roads curved beneath oak canopies draped in Spanish moss sunlight flickering through the leaves in broken gold. When the gates came into view, tall and white against the green, I slowed, not because I hesitated, but because I wanted to see them properly. I had paid for that entrance, its engraved nameplate and gilded trim, during one of Darren's budget shortfalls, months ago. The guard at the post nodded politely and lifted the barrier. My name was still on their system. I parked along the far row where staff usually left their cars. The main lot shimmered with polished chrome and designer badges, Jaguars, Teslas, and one vintage Bentley with ivory ribbons fluttering from the mirrors. Guests began to arrive in clusters of perfume chiffon and laughter, the kind of easy laughter that only comes when one has never worried about bills or appearances. I watched them from the shade of a magnolia tree, their pastel dresses blending into the garden like painted porcelain. Charleston society was on full display today, the heirs of builders, bankers, and developers who dined in old stone mansions and believed heritage was a matter of birth rather than conduct. They wouldn't see me, not really. To them I was background a woman whose dress was elegant but too plain, whose jewelry held sentiment rather than value. Still, I stood straight, my back against the wind, and waited. At 9:45, the Alden's convoy arrived 3 black sedans, one carrying Sierra in her lace gown. She stepped out carefully, holding the skirt high enough to show her diamond-encrusted heels. Her father, Charles Alden, hovered close, one hand resting lightly on her arm, as if escorting an investment rather than a daughter. Our eyes met briefly. His expression didn't change. It was a polite emptiness, the same face I'd seen at charity galas when he met waitstaff who dared make conversation. He gave me the smallest nod, the kind that meant I've seen you. Please stay in your place. I returned it with one of my own, an accountant's nod. Neutral, factual, unprovoked. A few minutes later, Darren appeared at the top of the steps leading to the veranda. His tuxedo fit well, but the posture beneath it didn't. He scanned the crowd once and saw me immediately. I watched his throat tighten. He looked down, fiddled with his cufflinks, and moved toward the photographers. It wasn't anger I felt then, nor sadness, just distance. The kind of distance that stretches between two people who once spoke the same language, but now use the same words to mean entirely different things. Around us, the wedding staff hurried florists, fixing garlands, servers, polishing glasses, the string quartet tuning their instruments. The music floated like mist over the lawn, soft and brittle. Somewhere near the entrance, I overheard Leona, the coordinator, arguing quietly into her headset about pending authorization. The irony almost made me smile. The world they had built, every borrowed shimmer of it, was already trembling at its foundation, and yet they moved as if nothing could touch them. When the bell tower struck 10, I adjusted my purse and walked a few paces closer to the edge of the terrace. From there, I could see Darren again, standing beside Sierra, as the photographer positioned them near the fountain. The same fountain I had once donated for the club's renovation fund. He turned slightly, our eyes meeting for just a second longer this time. His face betrayed the flicker of recognition, not surprise, but guilt. I didn't move, didn't wave, didn't speak. I just stood beneath the magnolia tree, calm and composed, the scent of its blossoms, sharp in the warm air. In Charleston, appearances are a currency, and silence, if wielded well, can be the sharpest kind of wealth. The ceremony was set for noon, and by 11, the courtyard shimmered with heat and soft music. The smell of roses and sugar frosting mixed with salt air from the harbor. Guests were gathering near the white arch draped in orchids, their chatter blending into one polished hum. I stood near the lower path that led from the parking lot to the main terrace, still half in shadow. From there, I could see Darren and Sierra at the top of the marble steps, he in his tailored tuxedo, she in lace that glittered like sea foam under the sun. The sight might have undone me once. Not now. When I started walking toward the terrace, a few heads turned. Conversations faltered, subtle but noticeable. I heard someone whisper, "Is that his mother?" Another voice answered softly, "I thought she wasn't coming." Halfway up the steps, Sierra descended to meet me. The smile on her face was fixed in the way expensive things sometimes are, uncracked, soulless, meant to last an event, but not a lifetime. "Mrs. Marwick," she said lightly, though her voice had a thin edge. "I'm sorry, there must be a misunderstanding. This area is reserved for family only." I met her eyes, steady. "That would make me the first one qualified to be here." Her expression twitched, then smoothed. "We just thought, given the guest list, the press and everything, it might be better for everyone if you weren't photographed today." From behind her, Charles Alden appeared, watch gleaming, smile polite. "It's a private affair, Leona," he said, as though explaining a tax law to someone who wouldn't understand it. "I see," I said. Darren appeared then, drawn by the tension. His face was flushed from the heat, or guilt, perhaps both. He stepped between us, eyes darting to the guests who had begun to notice. "Mom," he said softly, "please don't make this harder." "Sierra's right. It's complicated. You weren't supposed to come." The words were careful, almost apologetic, but there was something rehearsed beneath them. A phrase he'd practiced in the mirror, perhaps coached by someone else. I studied his face, the faint stubble he'd missed, shaving the line between his brows I remembered from when he was a boy trying to solve math problems. I wanted to say his name the way I used to, slowly, full of pride, but the sound caught somewhere deep in my throat. The music above shifted into a lighter melody. A few guests, realizing what was happening, pretended to check their phones. Others watched without shame. "I came to wish you well," I said quietly. "I know," Darren said, "but please, just go home. We'll talk later." For a long moment, none of us moved. The world narrowed to the hum of cicadas, the click of someone's camera shutter, and the tight ache beneath my ribs. Then I nodded. "All right, Darren." Relief flickered across his face, quick and small. He thought that was the end of it. I adjusted the strap of my purse and added calm as breath. "But before I go, sweetheart, check your phone." He frowned, confused. "What?" "Check it," I said again, softly. And then I turned. My heels clicked against the marble as I descended, each step even deliberate. The murmurs followed me down the stairs, swelling like wind through tall grass. Somewhere behind me, I heard Sierra whisper sharply to him, and then a gasp, a sound that broke through the polite music like glass. The string quartet kept playing, unaware or unwilling to stop. The guests didn't know where to look. I didn't turn around to see what he saw on that screen. The sky-blue fabric of my dress brushed against the white railing as I reached the gate, sunlight glinting off the brass nameplate I'd once helped fund. My reflection shimmered there for a moment, framed by the carved letters of a club that had always believed people like me should stay outside its gates. The wind shifted, carrying the faint echo of Sierra's voice, something urgent, disbelieving. I opened the car door, the leather warm beneath my hand, and drove away without looking back. The sound reached him first, an almost innocent vibration, muffled against the linen pocket of his jacket. Darren ignored it at first, smiling stiffly for a photographer who was adjusting the angle near the fountain. But when it buzzed again, and then again, his expression faltered. He pulled the phone from his pocket, eyes dropping to the glowing screen. The guests around him were still talking, laughing, unaware that the quiet device in his hand was beginning to unthread everything. The first notification read, "Authorized user removed Marwick family credit account." His brow furrowed. He swiped down another alert, appearing almost immediately. "Wire transfer canceled, Magnolia Grove Country Club, $8, $400. The color began to drain from his face. Sierra noticed it before anyone else. She stepped closer, whispering sharply, "What's wrong?" He didn't answer. The phone buzzed again, this time with a different tone, a message from the family attorney. Trust amendment confirmed, beneficiary update executed successfully. Darren scrolled his hand, trembling slightly. The series of emails and alerts stacked one on top of another, each stamped with the same timestamp, 11:02 a.m., the exact moment his mother had told him to check his phone. Darren Sierra's voice rose, still soft, but edged with irritation. "What is it?" He turned the screen toward her. The reflection of the white tent glimmered across the glass, slicing the words in half. She read them once, then twice. Her lips parted, then pressed together in disbelief. "What does this mean?" she demanded. "It means—" His voice cracked, and he stopped. He scrolled frantically, looking for some mistake, some auto-corrected detail that might undo the reality on the screen. But there was no error. Each alert was official, confirmed, irreversible. He opened the banking app. The shared account line had vanished. The trust document email included a PDF attachment, his mother's signature beneath the amendment. Legal. Filed. Binding. He tried calling her, but the call went straight to voicemail. Her calm, recorded message: "You've reached Leona Marwick. Please leave a message," and a number felt suddenly like mockery, too polite for the chaos erupting behind him. The music continued. Guests posed for photos, unaware that the financial scaffolding holding the entire wedding together had just been pulled away. Sierra's father appeared beside them, confusion creasing his brow. "Is something wrong?" Darren's mouth opened, but no sound came out. He looked at his fiancée, her lace veil catching the light like a net, and whispered, "The payment, it's gone. She canceled everything." "What do you mean, canceled?" Sierra asked, the calm tone breaking at the edges. "I mean," he said quietly, "it was never mine to spend." The world around them carried on the soft laughter, the music, the smell of orchids, but for Darren, the noise blurred into a low hum. The phone in his hand, still lit, buzzed one last time. Notification: transaction complete. The Miles Marwick Foundation established. He stared at the screen until it dimmed, the reflection of the fountain flickering across the black glass. The weight in his chest deepened, not just the shock of loss, but the dawning knowledge that the life he'd built had always been borrowed, every stone mortared with his mother's quiet generosity. And now, with a few keystrokes and one signature, she had returned it all to its rightful owner. The quartet's music faltered mid-note, like a breath held too long. The murmur of voices swelled beneath the tent as one of the event coordinators, a young man in a navy blazer, hurried toward the platform. His earpiece glinted in the sun. Behind him, servers slowed their pace trays, trembling slightly in their hands. Elena Rivas, the head coordinator, stepped forward, trying to mask her alarm with a practiced smile. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, her voice carrying just enough to reach the first rows, "we're experiencing a brief delay. We appreciate your patience." A ripple of unease spread through the crowd. Guests fanned themselves with programs, exchanged glances, whispered names that shouldn't have been whispered at all. Cameras tilted, curious. Darren stood frozen near the altar phone, still in hand, his expression blank. Sierra leaned toward him, whispering furiously, but his lips barely moved. From the edge of the terrace, I watched. No one noticed me, just another guest, perhaps a relative too far from the spotlight to matter. The magnolia branches above cast shifting shadows across the grass. Elena crossed the courtyard to Charles Alden, her voice low but urgent. "Mr. Alden, I'm sorry, but the final wire transfer hasn't cleared. Without it, the club can't authorize staff to proceed." "It's policy." Charles blinked, his composure cracking for the first time. "That's absurd." The groom's mother was handling the payment. She canceled the authorization, Sir Elena said, glancing down at her clipboard. It was confirmed this morning. Our accounting department received notice from the bank. He stared at her color rising to his cheeks. We're in the middle of a wedding, for God's sake. Do you know who's attending this event? I do, sir, she replied evenly. But without payment, the event cannot continue. The band stopped playing altogether now. Guests shifted uncomfortably. Phones lifted discreetly. Somewhere in the back, someone whispered, "Did she say canceled?" Charles turned sharply, scanning the terrace, until his gaze landed on me. He started down the steps, his stride clipped and heavy. Sierra's mother Vivian followed a few paces behind her face, pale under the summer hat. When he reached me, his voice dropped low the way men speak when they're trying to control a fire that's already spreading. "Leona," he said, "I don't know what kind of misunderstanding this is, but you've just humiliated your own son in front of half of Charleston." I met his stare calmly. "I didn't humiliate him, Charles. I just stopped financing the illusion." He took a step closer, lowering his voice further. "You realize people are watching. This isn't just about money, it's reputation." I let a faint smile curve at the corner of my mouth. "Then perhaps now you'll understand what real credit means. It's built, not borrowed." For a moment, he said nothing. His jaw worked, eyes darting toward the guests who were beginning to drift closer, pretending to admire the flowers while listening. Behind him, Sierra stood rigid, her veil trembling in the wind. Darren hadn't moved. Elena returned, flanked by two club managers. "Alden," she said carefully, without payment. "I'll have to ask that we suspend all service and ask guests to vacate the reception area until the account is settled." Vivian tried to interject, but Charles silenced her with a look. "We'll handle it," he muttered. "No," I said softly. "You'll pay for it, there's a difference." He turned away, chest heaving, and walked back toward the terrace. The managers followed. Guests were beginning to leave their seats now, gathering near the entrance, their voices rising in a low hum of gossip and disbelief. A photographer hesitated near the fountain camera, dangling at his side. "Do we keep shooting?" he whispered to his assistant. The young woman shook her head. "Not until they pay," she said quietly. I stepped back beneath the magnolia tree, letting the shade cool my face. The wind carried the scent of salt water and perfume, the sound of whispers like surf on the shore. Above the murmur, I caught one clear voice, a woman in pearls murmuring to her friend, "Imagine all that money and not a cent of it theirs." The orchestra began packing their instruments. The chairs were half empty now. On the steps, Darren still stood motionless, the phone hanging loosely in his hand, its screen dark. I turned toward the open gates where the afternoon light burned gold against the pavement. Behind me, the sound of unraveling elegance filled the air, a life of borrowed grace finally meeting its balance sheet. The courtyard had turned into a tableau of confusion, guests, whispering servers frozen mid-step, the string quartet silently packing their instruments into velvet-lined cases. The only sound that carried was the sharp clip of my heels against the flagstone as I stepped out from the shade. Darren saw me immediately. He moved toward me with quick, uneven strides, his jacket half open, his tie crooked now. The crowd parted around him, drawn by the tension that always follows a public fall. "Mom," he said, his voice strained, almost cracking. "Why would you do this to me?" The question trembled in the air, not an accusation, but a plea, one that came too late. I looked at him, really looked. The man before me was the same boy who once refused to go to school without my approval, who used to sit beside me at the kitchen table while I balanced accounts, his small fingers tracing the edges of my ledger pages. Somewhere between those evenings and this moment, something inside him had learned to expect without asking. "I didn't do this to you," I said softly. "I just stopped doing it for you." His eyes flickered confusion and disbelief fighting for dominance. "You don't understand. This is my life. Everything I've worked for was built on what I gave you," I interrupted. "And I don't regret giving. But there comes a point where giving turns into erasing yourself." I think I reached it. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You've embarrassed me in front of everyone." I shook my head. "No, Darren. You embarrassed yourself when you forgot who made it possible for you to stand here at all." Behind him, Sierra tore off her veil, her father speaking hurriedly to someone on the phone. Vivian dabbed her eyes, pretending tears could hide fury. Every perfect stitch of their social fabric was coming undone, thread by golden thread. Darren's jaw tightened, his hand curling into a fist before falling limply at his side. For the first time, he looked small to me. Not young, not innocent, just unanchored. "Do you hate me now?" he asked quietly. I felt the question hit somewhere deep, where pride and tenderness live uncomfortably close. "No," I said. "I love you enough to stop pretending this was love." His lips parted as if to reply, but no sound came. Around us, guests began to drift away, half out of politeness, half out of fear of witnessing too much truth. The white chairs gleamed empty under the sun. The photographer had already left. I reached out and adjusted the lapel of his jacket, smoothing it the way I used to before his first job interview. "You'll find your footing," I said, "but you'll have to earn the ground this time." Then I turned and walked toward the gates. Behind me, someone called my name, maybe Darren, maybe no one. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of wilting orchids and salt. The brass plaque beside the entrance glinted as I passed its engraving sharp and clean under the light. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was walking away from something. I was walking toward myself. By Monday morning, Charleston had already moved on, or so it seemed. The magnolias near the riverfront had shed their blossoms overnight, leaving the air heavy with sweetness and decay. I sat on a weathered bench along the Battery, watching the water shift from blue to gray under the morning light. Seagulls circled above their cries, sharp and distant. In my lap lay the folded copy of the Post and Courier, its front page headline, "Impossible to Ignore." Charleston wedding canceled amid payment dispute at Magnolia Grove. Below it, a photo of Darren and Sierra captured mid-chaos faces turned away from the camera, frozen in the moment when everything collapsed. The article was brief, factual, written with the kind of polite detachment that local journalists reserve for scandals among the well-dressed. Still, the words cut deep, unresolved financial arrangements, unexpected withdrawal of funds, guests dismissed from venue after payment, verification failure. They didn't name me, but they didn't need to. Charleston was a small city with long memory and quick gossip. I closed the paper and set it beside me, staring out at the slow-moving river. For 2 days, I'd told myself I felt peace, that I'd simply corrected an imbalance. But now, in the soft quiet of morning, doubt began to seep through the cracks of certainty. Had I gone too far? Across the water, church bells began to toll. Each note felt heavier than the last. I thought of Miles again, how he used to say that doing what's right rarely feels right in the moment. Still, I wondered what he would have thought of this particular reckoning. The phone buzzed in my bag. For a moment, I didn't move. Then slowly, I reached for it. It wasn't Darren. It was a notification from the Marwick Analytics mailing list, a public statement from his company. Due to unforeseen financial restructuring, our expansion project is currently on hold. We remain committed to transparency and thank our partners for their patience. A hollow statement, but I knew what it meant. His investors had backed out. Without my guarantee, without the comfort of my name on those contracts, his startup's credit had collapsed like a house of cards. I imagined him now sitting in his office, scrolling through emails from people who no longer returned his calls, watching numbers shift from black to red. The thought didn't bring satisfaction, only a deep ache that spread through my chest like slow-moving water. I placed the phone face down beside the folded newspaper and closed my eyes. When I opened them again, a small boy was standing a few feet away, throwing crumbs to pigeons. His mother, a young woman in a blue cardigan, watched him from the bench across the path. She looked tired but proud, her posture steady, her smile soft and unguarded. There was something familiar in the way she straightened the boy's collar and brushed off his sleeve. The quiet endurance of a parent doing everything alone. For a moment, I saw myself years ago balancing Darren's future on the edge of every checkbook line, every late-night calculation, every compromise that felt temporary but became permanent. The wind picked up, lifting the edges of the newspaper, scattering its pages across the ground. I didn't reach for them. Let the story go, I thought. Let it travel farther than I can. The boy laughed as a pigeon fluttered past, wings flashing in the sunlight. His laughter filled the space where guilt had settled, softening it just enough for me to breathe. Maybe justice didn't always look kind. Maybe it never could. But I had given Darren the one thing I'd denied myself for too long, a life defined by consequences, not rescue. Still, as I watched the tide crawl higher against the stones, I couldn't shake the question that followed the sound of those church bells, quiet but relentless. When a lesson costs love, does anyone truly win? By the end of the week, the city had turned the story into a fable. I heard fragments of it in grocery aisles, at the bakery, in the low hum of coffee shop gossip. That poor boy, someone would say. His mother canceled everything. Others whispered with that mix of fascination and judgment Charleston reserved for quiet scandals. I had become a cautionary tale, the mother who ruined a wedding. It was Marjorie Langford, an old neighbor and friend from church, who told me outright. We met for tea at her porch on Sunday afternoon, the air thick with honeysuckle. "They're saying cruel things, Leona," she said gently, stirring her cup. "People love their stories tidy, you know that." I smiled faintly. "Then let them keep it tidy. The truth would only confuse them." Marjorie hesitated. "They think you acted out of pride." "Maybe I did," I said, watching the steam curl upward, "but pride's cheaper than regret." We didn't talk much after that. The silence between us wasn't hostile, just heavy, like old furniture that couldn't be moved. When I left, she squeezed my hand, and I knew she pitied me without meaning to. That evening, I drove to St. Philip's Cemetery, where the oaks leaned over the old stones like tired sentinels. The air smelled faintly of salt and cut grass. I parked near the back, where the noise of the city faded to nothing, and walked toward the small granite marker with Miles Marwick, 1948-2015, carved into it. I knelt beside it, brushing away a few fallen leaves. "It's been 8 years," I whispered, tracing the worn edge of his name. "And I still catch myself waiting for you to tell me I've done the right thing." The words came slowly at first, then steadier, as if the stillness around me gave them permission. "They think I was cruel, Miles, that I embarrassed our son. Maybe they're right. But he forgot who he was raised by, who paid the price so he could stand among people who would have stepped over us otherwise." The wind stirred through the moss above the sound, soft as breath. "I did what you would have done," I said quietly. "Didn't I?" There was no answer, of course, just the faint creak of the oak limbs and the slow roll of distant thunder from the harbor. But for a fleeting second, I felt something lighter settle inside me, Not peace exactly, but a lessening of weight. I stayed there until dusk, watching the sky turn the color of pewter. A few fireflies blinked near the hedges, their small lights flickering and fading. When I stood, I pressed my palm once against the cold stone. "Rest easy, Miles," I murmured. "I'll try to, too." Driving home, the streets glowed with the last of the day's warmth. Through the open window, the night smelled of river water and jasmine. I didn't know whether I'd been right or wrong, only that I'd finally acted on my own terms. And sometimes, that had to be enough. The following Sunday began the way quiet days often do, without ceremony, without plan. The sunlight crept through the shutters in slow, golden lines, warming the edge of my coffee cup and the framed photo of Miles that still sat by the window. I had just finished watering the ferns when the phone rang. I almost didn't answer. The number wasn't saved, but it was familiar enough to stir something in my chest. When I picked up, the voice that met me was hesitant, careful. "Mom." For a moment I said nothing. The silence between us stretched thin, fragile as thread. "It's me," Darren continued. "I didn't know if you'd pick up." "I did," I said softly. "You caught me early." He let out a small, nervous laugh. It sounded different, less confident, stripped of that polished ease he'd learned to wear like armor. I wanted to tell you something. I got a job. Real one this time." I sat down at the kitchen table where the morning light fell across the grain of the wood. "That's good," I said. "What kind of job?" "Financial analysis. Entry level. Small firm in Mount Pleasant." He paused. "They don't know who I am, who you are, I mean. I didn't use the family name. I just applied like anyone else." His words came out haltingly, as though he wasn't used to reporting to me without an expectation of approval or applause. "That sounds like a start," I said. "It is." There was a short silence. "I wanted you to know, because I don't want you to think I'm calling about money. I'm not." "I didn't," I replied. He laughed again, quieter this time. "You always were 2 steps ahead of me." For a moment, neither of us spoke. I could hear the faint rhythm of waves through the open window, and behind it, his breathing, uneven searching. "Mom," he said finally, "I know what people are saying. I've heard it all about the wedding, about you. I didn't defend you then. I should have." "You don't owe me explanations," I said. "I do." His voice cracked a little. "You were right. About everything. I depended on you because it was easier than earning anything myself. When you stopped, it hurt, but it also woke me up." I traced a circle on the table with my finger, listening. There was humility in his tone, something I hadn't heard in years. "I wanted to hate you," he said quietly, "but I couldn't. Because deep down I knew you were the only person who ever told me the truth without wanting anything in return." The words came out raw, stripped of the arrogance that used to wrap around every sentence he spoke. "I'm proud of you," I said simply. "Not for the job, for calling." On the other end, I could almost hear him swallow. "Does that mean we're okay?" I thought of the graveyard of the questions I'd whispered to Miles, of the heavy silence that had followed. "It means we're beginning," I said. He exhaled, shaky but lighter. "I'll take that." We talked a little longer about rent, about the new office, about nothing of consequence but everything that mattered. Before hanging up, he added softly, "I'll come by next Sunday, if that's all right." "It is," I said. "Bring coffee." After the line went quiet, I stayed at the table, letting the morning light stretch across my hands. The house felt fuller somehow, not with noise, but with the faint echo of something long missing. Outside, the bells of St. Michael's began to ring. Each note carried through the open window like a pulse, steady and alive, marking not the end of something, but the slow, patient start of repair. By midweek, the air had turned cooler, a soft wind brushing through the open windows of the house. I spent the morning clearing drawers that hadn't been touched in years, Miles's study, his old desk still holding the scent of cedar and faint tobacco. Dust motes floated through the light like tiny fragments of memory. In the bottom drawer, under a stack of neatly folded letters and a tarnished fountain pen, I found the small mahogany box. Its brass hinge squeaked when I opened it, and there, nestled in dark velvet, lay Miles's gold watch, the one he'd worn nearly every day of our marriage. The face was scratched, but still elegant, its steady tick barely audible, yet somehow still faithful. I remembered him winding it at night before bed, the ritual precise and quiet. He'd never trusted digital clocks. A man should feel time move, he used to say. It keeps you honest. I turned the watch over in my palm, running my thumb along the engraving I'd chosen for our 10th anniversary, Miles and Leona 1988. Back then, time had felt infinite something. We could spend freely and still have plenty left. Now, as I watched the thin hands move, I realized how wrong we'd both been. I sat down at the desk and took a piece of cream stationery from the drawer. My handwriting had grown slower over the years, more deliberate. I wrote Darren. Time was the only thing your father couldn't buy. Use yours better than he did. Mom, no speeches, no explanations, just the truth pared down to its simplest form. I placed the note inside the box, then closed the lid and tied a single length of blue ribbon around it, the same shade as the dress I'd worn to his wedding. That wasn't. The ribbon felt like a circle closing a quiet knot where so much chaos had once lived. At the post office, the clerk, a young woman with auburn hair and the kind of kindness that doesn't ask questions, weighed the parcel carefully. Fragile, she asked. Not exactly, I said, then added, but yes, handle it gently. She nodded and placed it among the others, waiting for the afternoon pickup. I stood there a moment longer than I needed to, watching the small box disappear onto the sorting shelf. When I stepped outside, the sky had shifted a clearer blue than it had been in days. I walked down the block toward the river, the air crisp with early autumn. Children were playing near the benches, their laughter carried by the wind. For the first time in months, I didn't flinch at the sound. It didn't remind me of what I'd lost. It reminded me of what continued. That evening, I brewed chamomile tea and sat by the window, the same place I'd sat through grief, doubt, and resolve. The faint ticking of Miles's old wall clock filled the quiet. It struck me how everything meaningful I'd kept from him had nothing to do with wealth, just habits lessons and the spaces we'd shared in silence. I pictured Darren opening the package, the watch glinting against the light, the note folded beside it. I didn't need to see his reaction. The gesture wasn't meant to stir guilt or forgiveness. It was an offering, a reminder that time, like love, only mattered when you learned not to waste it. Outside dusk deepened over the Charleston rooftops. The first streetlights flickered on, and in their glow I felt something I hadn't in years. Not victory, not sorrow, but stillness. The kind that comes when you've finally said all that needs saying, not with words, but with the weight of what you choose to leave behind. By the time winter settled over Charleston, the air had grown thin and bright, the kind of cold that smelled faintly of salt and pine. The house was quiet that morning, but not lonely. I had learned to enjoy the kind of silence that wasn't absence, it was peace. I was pouring coffee when I heard the knock on the front door. It wasn't the sharp, hurried rhythm of delivery men or neighbors. It was hesitant, two soft taps, then one more after a pause. When I opened it, Darren stood on the porch holding a paper bag from the cafe downtown. His hair was shorter, his posture different, less polished, more grounded. The winter light caught the faint lines under his eyes, the kind that only responsibility leaves behind. "Hi, Mom," he said almost sheepish. "I brought cinnamon rolls. They smelled too good to pass up." "Come in," I said, stepping aside. He paused, eyes catching on the small brass plaque beside the door. It gleamed softly in the light, newly polished. The words etched on it were simple, "Home by invitation only." He smiled faintly. "That's new." "It is," I said. "Helps me remember who belongs here and why." Inside, the air smelled of coffee and rosemary. I set 2 mugs on the table as he unpacked the bag. His hands weren't as steady as they used to be, but they were sure in a different way. Steady through effort, not assumption. We sat across from each other, the same table where years ago I'd signed the papers that freed us both in painful ways. "So," I said, "how's work?" He smiled, rubbing the back of his neck. "Still standing. It's not glamorous, but it's mine. I wake up early, pay bills on time, and I haven't used a credit card in months. You'd be proud." "I am," I said, and meant it. He took a sip of coffee, eyes wandering to the window, where the garden shimmered under pale sunlight. "I got your package," he said softly. "The watch." He nodded. I've been wearing it every day. I had the strap replaced, but kept everything else. The tick's still strong." "Your father liked things that lasted," I said. "I know." He looked at me, then really looked, without the guarded distance of a son trying to prove something. "You were right, Mom. About all of it. I didn't understand what you were trying to teach me. I thought you wanted control, but you just wanted me to stand on my own." I reached for my cup, feeling the warmth seep through my fingers. "Every parent wants their child to stand," I said. "We just forget that falling is part of it." He smiled, a real one this time. "I fell pretty hard." "Yes," I said, "but you stood back up." The conversation drifted after that, to small things, safe things. He told me about the office his co-workers, how he was saving for a modest apartment across town. I told him about the neighborhood book club, about the women who came every Thursday and always stayed too long. It felt easy, ordinary. When he rose to leave, I walked him to the porch. The afternoon sun had softened, turning the brass plaque to a dull gold. He looked at it again before turning to me. "Do I need an invitation next time?" he asked, half smiling. I shook my head. "You've already earned one." He nodded, then leaned forward and kissed my cheek. The gesture was quiet, almost reverent, the way grown men do when they finally understand what love costs. As he walked down the path toward his car, I watched the light trace the edge of his shoulders, strong and steady. The world felt balanced again, not perfect, but honest. I turned back toward the door, my reflection catching in the brass plate. The house behind me was warm alive, and for the first time in years, entirely mine. I closed the door gently, locking it out of habit, not fear. Some doors I thought aren't closed to keep people out. They're closed so the right ones know when to knock.